Everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So in terms of changes to the profession, the urban planning profession really didn't change much because we use technology so much. I found we shifted over to a remote situation pretty easily, pretty quickly. If you have email servers, that happened pretty quickly. Cities were a little bit slower. A lot of staff at various municipalities didn't have access to their various servers, applications, how they were circulated. But within a few weeks, the urban planning world is more or less functioning regularly, just in the virtual realm. The thing that is the most complicated has been public meetings, community engagement, public meetings. That's a huge part of urban planning. So how does that happen in the virtual world? So that's the profession today. But before before getting into some questions later in the seminar, I thought it would be interesting just to provide a couple of thoughts. Modern urban planning came out of the Industrial Revolution. So around the 1800s, you had a huge spurt of growth in cities. And what had happened, the population increased tremendously. You had industry, you had factories, and suddenly cities were not healthy places to live. There was sewage mixing with smog, mixing with cramped conditions. So urban planning and also engineering came along and said, there's a better way that we can design healthy cities. So then they started separating and distinguishing land uses, creating sewer systems, water systems, and that sort of was the kernel of growth for modern urban planning. And then a few decades later, in the 1950s, we saw a similar reaction happening where people moved to auto-oriented suburbs because they said downtown, lots of cases, people were scared of downtown because that's where immigrants were. That's where visible minorities were. So then there was a flight to the suburbs. So I think the similarity between these two points in history are that people are fleeing the city for various reasons. And the question is, are we going to see a similar flight or a similar response today? A lot of people are scared of cities because that's where they're the most dense. It's not smog, it's not immigrants, quote unquote, but now it's COVID. Do people want to leave cities now because of COVID? So I think there is an understandable reaction to leave cities because that's where it's most dense. But the counter of that is in cities, that's where you have amenities, that's where you have hospitals, that's where you have restaurants, that's where you have access to all these things that outside of cities are sparse. So I just kind of wanted to start with that, a few ideas to get it going.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I'm just going to pass over the mic to Adam Karoly for a real estate update.
Thanks, Rochi. Hi, everybody. I'm going to start off by saying that I'm going to be the first one to tell you that no one really knows what's going to happen to the real estate investing industry because of COVID. I think that anybody who tries to sell you that they do know what's going to happen is really just selling you a bag of magic beans, to be perfectly honest. I'm just going to provide some insight into why I think some things are going to happen. But that's just based off of the things that I'm looking at, just based off of people that I've spoken to in the past. As many of you, I'm sure, know that there are three different broad types of real estate industries. There's industrial, there's commercial, and there is residential. With regards to industrial, there has been a shift in recent years in investment strategy towards industrial because of the online shopping boom. The warehouses and logistics companies have seen the biggest growth over the last decade. And I think that COVID is only going to accelerate that further. You look at an example of Granite REIT, which is one of the larger industrial REITs in Canada. Their growth after the initial stock market tank in March has been unbelievable. I think it's jumped about 24 points, which is about 50% of its 50% growth. And we're expecting to see, especially in Toronto, between 13.1 to 17.8 million square feet of new industrial space by the end of 2021, which is going to further fuel industry growth that we've already seen. Commercially, office space has been at a premium, especially in a city like Toronto, as more and more companies are being forced to learn how to work remotely. I think we're going to see more and more organizations create online-only roles in order to save on rent. Some of the smaller companies may even completely go online. And this is going to force landlords into having to think creatively in order to fill office space that until now has never been an issue. CBRE released a Q1 report saying that Toronto office space is more tied to tech demand and immigration than economic performance, which is a reason why I don't think Toronto vacancy will spike like in many other places, since vacancy is currently 2%. But in thinking of the sheer cost of rent right now for office space, combined with COVID, we may still see a slight spike in occupancy. On the retail side, there's already been a departure from investments for places like shopping malls because in-person retail has taken a hit. And I think that, again, COVID is going to really just increase and accelerate that movement. Residentially, multifamily actually flourished for the most part. Timing collections have been an issue, as many of you would expect. But by month end, a number of landlords that I spoke to say their collection rates have actually been pretty much in line with what they were before the pandemic. For example, CAPREIT, which is the largest multi-residential landlord in Canada, reported 98% collections for April with a 98.2% occupancy, which is industry standard. And because of the economic shutdown, expenses required to upkeep the property, like amenity maintenance, site staff, CapEx work, that's gone down, and this has actually positively impacted the bottom line. But there are some people who are saying condo sales and rentals could tank because of the Airbnb effect. You can't do short-term rentals anymore for them right now. So those may go into long-term rentals or even sales, distress sales. And a lot of you may be thinking about whether you can now get a deal on a house. And I think that, yes, the housing market is going to take a hit. There's mortgage foreclosures could increase supply, where previously supply, especially in a city like Toronto, was really scarce. Moody's, who is a big analytics company in the US, says that a 1% increase in unemployment leads to a 4% decrease in housing prices. I don't think something like that is going to happen in Toronto for various reasons, but that is a stat that I think is good for thought when contemplating where housing prices are going. Unemployment was 13% as of the end of April in Canada, compared to 5.7% at the end of 2019. So that is where I see the real estate investment industry going in those three different markets.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Adam. And lastly, I'm going to pass it over to Noam for an architecture and design update for us before we dive into the discussion.
Hello, everyone. Ruchi, thanks for hosting this tonight. So I think we're in it's a really interesting time for architecture and design, and architects and designers play a big role in how we're going to be able to control and prevent this disease from spreading, especially in the workplace and in places where there's gathering. I think it's really important, I think, as part of the context of this conversation of how things have changed and how things are going to change, to say there's always two possibilities. One is this is somewhat temporary and we're going to get a cure quite soon, or we could have this for the next foreseeable future and there's going to be no cure. We're going to have to live with this virus. Obviously, that's something we don't want to hear, but there is that possibility. And I think that is going to affect how we're going to be designing our spaces, whether it's a control of the virus or whether we're going to prevent future outbreaks through design. It's still too early to know. So there's a lot of speculation and predictions in the creative and design industry right now. I've seen a lot of architects and designers using their resources. A lot of architects have 3D printers and laser cutters, so they're creating masks and they're helping with the PPE movement and with the lack of supply. But I think it's just such an interesting time right now where there's so many changes and so many possibilities. It's hard to know what's next and what to predict. But with challenges like this is where the most innovative designs come out of. And I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in the workplace, in the home, how things are going to change in the home. Retail is going to change dramatically. So it's very interesting. And just to sort of give you guys a little bit of a background to office design and the workspace. So what Daniel was saying earlier, how planning came out of the Industrial Revolution. The whole concept of going to a destination for work was from the Industrial Revolution. It's a very Victorian way about thinking about work. You go there, you go to one destination. We don't really need a single destination now, because work really is about activity. It's about doing an activity or a task. The whole concept of the 9 to 5 also came out of the Industrial Revolution, where trade unions basically put pressure on companies to limit to an 8-hour workday, and we're still doing this over 100 years later. So the way that we work has been very slow to sort of to move forward, and it's been stuck in old ways. And I think this has been a catalyst now to really project us into the future, and to adapt to technology and to really utilize that technology that's out there. We haven't really been utilizing it to this extent. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes in work and working from home, this now working from home movement. And it's not to say that we're all it's black or white, we're either going to be working from home or not. But I think companies, as Adam was saying, are going to be a lot more open to having their employees work from home, and that's going to change how we work. With regards to retail, retail has basically died overnight to the extent of physical brick and mortar space. So how do we design spaces that still draw people out, still build that brand recognition to spaces? And you've seen recently a lot of the larger companies creating more experience centers rather than a store to go and buy a product. Apple is kind of an experience in itself. KitKat has a new experience center in Yorkdale. I think once stores start opening up, we're going to see a lot more of these. They're kind of like entertainment centers where you can build that brand recognition and build that brand sort of loyalty, rather than go somewhere specifically to buy a product, because you can do that online. So that's where that's changing. And then residential is changing, because now the priority is, if we are going to be working from home, do our current houses function in a way that we can work from home? Are they flexible? Do we have space to work? Everything moved to an open plan in the last decade or two, decade and a half. Now are we going to move back to a compartmentalized living, even in the workspace? So it's just a very, very exciting time in terms of design. And I think, there's so many possibilities that are out there, and we'll discuss some of them, I think, in the course of tonight, about what some of those changes have already been implemented and what we might expect to see from the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Noam. Okay, so we're going to get started with our first discussion question for the evening. And Daniel, we're going to start with you for this one. So the question is, the world has been turned upside down as our cities, our workplaces, and as have our cities, our workplaces, and our homes. What changes have you seen in your fields, and where are you going from here?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing tremendous changes happening just to the city as a whole, not necessarily urban planning changes. One thing that Noam mentioned was that the places that we live in are shifting, right? If you're working from home, then your small apartment building is now might not seem as practical. Part of the reason why lots of people bought these tiny condo buildings in downtown Toronto was because all of downtown Toronto was their backyard. They could go to Hyde Park, they could go to Trinity Bellwoods. That was their backyard. So they didn't need the front porch, they didn't need their backyard. So in some cases, that was a choice because they had the whole city. Other times, people don't have that choice. The place that they can afford is in a small apartment building in St. Jamestown, Regent Park. So I think that what's really been interesting is now that people don't have those backyards anymore, those who have the advantage of having an actual backyard front porch, they can stay at home fairly easily. But those who don't, it's started to really show this distinction between, and part of it comes down to privilege as well, between those who have that private space and those who don't. So it's brought up a lot of questions of what do we do now with public space? So a lot of people were complaining that rather than closing down streets, the cars can now still move, but we're closing down High Park so people can't see the cherry blossoms. And I 100% get it why the city did that. You're going to have thousands of people swarming on this park to Instagram photos of the cherry blossoms. But it's this larger question of, the city is now, and governments, the city planners, architects, designers, real estate professionals, we're all dealing with what do we do with these public spaces? Who owns these public spaces? What's the best use of it? And I think one thing which I like tremendously is that they've been closing streets now to cars to allow them to bike. And they've said this is a priority. We recognize that people are driving less and people need to get outside of their house. So the city has closed down Bayview, parts of Bayview. They've closed down parts of Lakeshore. And I really, really like this change. And I honestly think it should continue in larger amounts. But that's sort of one way that urban planning and just the idea of cities and spaces has totally flipped on its head, where we've said, these smaller condominium buildings, they don't function the same way they used to function.
Yeah, I think from my area, a lot of money has kind of just completely flown out of the market. I mean, if you look at home sales for the month of April compared to the month of, let's say, for example, February, I think it's dropped something in the neighborhood of like 4 or 5 times what they were. And again, real estate at the end of the day is a simple economic supply and demand game, right? So there's just as much. So while supply wasn't very high in Toronto because of the lack of developments, supply is even less now because people aren't going to sell their homes where people aren't going to be able to, let's say, for example, go and see a house so easily. So I think that right now we're in a waiting game to see what's going to happen with prices, and prices have started to drop. I think the price of a single family home was like $950,000 a couple months ago, whereas now the median price of a home was like $860,000 this past month. And a lot of people are right now just currently sitting on their hands waiting for the best possible time to invest in real estate or make a purchase a house. And I think it's just kind of just become a long waiting game to see where the market's going. So everything's kind of just stagnated for the most part.
Cool. Yeah, I think, and just from an architecture and design perspective, I think there's an interesting change in, architects and designers are very sort of focused on, let's say, a residential architect will not necessarily be working on commercial projects and vice versa. And I think now that there's this fusion happening where you work from home, maybe when we go back to work, we'll be socializing at work more. And, you get kind of your camaraderie with your colleagues and building the culture, the office might be more for that. But really, we're kind of seeing that fusion of commercial architects with residential architects, where it's always been very isolated in the past. And I think even with things like WeWork, where they've designed it in a sort of homey way or like a hotel kind of feel, we've already started to see that cross design between the different industries, different parts of design. I think we're going to see that more and more specific to the architecture and design realm moving forward.
Very interesting. So I'll move on to our next question. So the next question, I'm going to direct this to Adam. So do you think that work from home will lead to a huge exodus to the suburbs?
I think that we were looking at a exodus to the suburbs already taking place before COVID had happened, just because of the sheer affordability of living in the city. Now, do I think that because I can work from home that I'm going to now go live in Barrie, Ontario, for example? I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I think there is still a desire to live in a city where you're close to a lot of different things. And I think that's something that's become important to a lot of people is now healthcare, right? So if you're living in a city or a town that has 50,000, 100,000 people, where's the closest hospital? Where like those are the types of things that I think a lot of people are putting value into when it comes to purchasing a home, and now that's just become more important. So while yes, there is an argument to be made that now I want more space because I don't trust being confined to a condo or an apartment building with hundreds of other families, I do think ultimately people are going to consider healthcare to be a major deciding factor in where they decide to move.
Yeah, I just want to add to that point. So I think this is a really interesting question. And I think it goes beyond the suburbs. I think now that we can essentially, or many of us can work from anywhere, why does it have to be, Thornhill or somewhere in Richmond Hill if you're living downtown, or London, Ontario, or Hamilton? You could go to Miami. If you're in a similar time zone, why couldn't you move somewhere which is warm? Maybe not as much, maybe this isn't as relevant for Canadians, but for any Americans, that are thinking of moving to suburbs, why wouldn't they move somewhere which is warmer? Where essentially you can live anywhere. And I have a friend actually who lives in New York. He's in a 1-bedroom apartment with his pregnant wife. They're about to have a baby, and they're both working remotely, and they're considering a move to Miami, or at least a temporary move to Miami until this hopefully blows over. I also have friends in New York who have kind of thought about moving out to the suburbs a few years from now, and they're thinking, maybe they'll consider the move now. So it's kind of speeding up. It's kind of speeding up everything in a sense. It's speeding up how we work. This is kind of projecting us a little bit into the future, even individually, where let's say, sorry, I got distracted there. So even individually, where you might be considering moving out to a suburb or to buying a house, you might consider doing that now, essentially. So yeah, it is interesting. Apparently, there are some people talking about moving to places like Texas and California. There's a little bit of a movement moving out from the colder climates into more of these traditional holiday destinations or warmer areas as well.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points you brought there. I'm gonna somewhat disagree. So one is, do I move to another city, right? If I move to Texas, can I get a bigger bang for my buck? Can I afford a large house versus a small condominium in downtown Toronto? Or can I move, let's say, within the GTA? Maybe there's a satellite office. I know that when we were prepping for this call, we talked about, will downtown Toronto still have that same hub destination status, or will you see the rise of these secondary cities? And I think you're going to have, Toronto will still be that main office hub, the financial district. That's where the big law firms are going to be. That's where the big financial firms are going to be. But then they might be looking to downtown Mississauga, downtown Vaughan, right? The VMC is on the subway line. These won't surpass downtown Toronto, but they're going to grow in popularity probably. But you'll probably have a bit of moving around to other cities, a bit of moving around to elsewhere within the GTA. But I still think that, Toronto, the big city, will have its sort of major draw. People like being close to restaurants, the office, and once this all opens back up, it's still the big city, in bright lights.
But I guess it depends to what extent it is going to open up again. So if we, I love the city. I've always been drawn to big cities, but my attraction to the cities are the hustle and bustle and the restaurants and the bars and the sort of condensation of all these people together. But if we're going to go through this and have this for a long period of time where we have to social distance, maybe I prefer to be in like a larger, you know, have a large backyard where I can, where I'm not crowded and I have my space. You know, I think it's the whole draw to the city is that hustle and bustle and activeness in the city. And if that doesn't come back to the extent, then maybe people are not going to be as drawn to these metropolitan centers.
Yeah, for sure. I think if this goes on for another year is very different from if it goes on for another 5 years. The two totally different scenarios.
Yeah. Great points. So actually just Noam, to go back to some things you were saying, you know, we are social beasts by nature, and most of us crave the stimulation and camaraderie of working with colleagues. So do you have any specifics of what some plans have looked like for, like you mentioned, you know, we're going from open concept to maybe more compartmentalized workspaces. Is there anything you have to add in terms of design that's changing already?
So it is interesting, and you know, there's been so much discussion and talk about this on social media. You know, everything on my LinkedIn feed is about the future of work and how this is changing and what's happening. There was a recent survey by Gartner, which surveyed, I think 200 or 400 CEOs. They said 74% of these CEOs are saying that some of their employees want on-site employees will now be remotely working fully after this pandemic. Mark Zuckerberg the other day said over the next 5 to 10 years, he thinks that 50% of people will be working remotely for Facebook, and the same with Twitter and all these other tech companies that are moving, you know, almost somewhat remotely. And it's ironic because these are the companies that sort of the Google office of the world, all these you know, these like fancy offices with pool ponds that are ubiquitous with the Google style offices. These are the companies now saying we don't necessarily need this anymore. They've invested like, I think, $1 billion into their campuses in California. So it is ironic. There's a lot of talk now about the next trend is this idea of the hub and spoke. So it's the hub and spoke model, basically, where there'll be like a central office with smaller satellite offices around. I think that, you know, again, ironically, WeWork was kind of about to kind of go under, or was doing really badly. Notel is really struggling right now. But I think as soon, you know, once the dust settles, a lot of landlords will want to think about doing co-working in their buildings, creating that flexibility in what they're offering. And I think the office could be not necessarily a place you go to work, but as I said earlier, somewhere where you build that culture, you might entertain clients, you have like a very strong brand presence in the office, but the default might now be working from home. So, you know, what is now the role of a designer? Are they now going to be helping each individual employee design their office space, or selecting furniture for each individual employees? There's so many possibilities of what might happen. I've started to see screens. I've actually been developing a product where this was actually before COVID, in response to actually privacy in the workplace, because, you know, we've been in this open workplace. There's a lot of mental health and wellness questions within the workplace. And the idea of having a bit more privacy where you're there every day and your colleagues can kind of look over your back. So creating privacy, sound, it's essentially like a modular furniture piece that kind of surrounds you, and you can customize how private your space is. So not necessarily the cubicle, but some sort of hybrid. But anyway, so all these things might come into play. Again, like, it always goes back to the same question: how long is this going to last for? You know, if it lasts indefinitely, then, you know, we might see an exodus from Bay Street, where we might have these kind of smaller team offices where just you and your team are coming together. You don't have these big centralized offices. It's very hard to say at this point. If we do go back to some sort of normalcy, I really believe that landlords are going to rethink how they're going to lease their space. Because a lot of people want the flexibility. A lot of companies want flexibility. Any company now that's think Adam can talk to this as well. Any company now that's about to renew their lease is going to consider whether they're going to take a 15,000 square foot space or whether they're going to take 5,000 square feet and have people work remotely or have people come in on different schedules. So that's really going to impact the workplace. The workplace is not going to be back to what it was 3 months ago. I truly believe that. I think it's these super, I call them like the super office, where they're like, you go there for the experience. If you can't do a specific task at home, you'll go there. If you want to entertain a client, you'll go there. And if you want to build that brand culture, you might have like a Friday drink at the office, which is really ironic because, you know, you're not going there necessarily to work anymore, but it's more to kind of build a bond with your teammates. So yeah, I think, that's where it could go.
Yeah, I think that to Noam's point, I think that we're going to see workplaces go either completely remotely, or some of the larger companies start to create roles that are online only. And you're starting to see it already. Shopify, Twitter, Facebook are hiring for roles that are remote only, or are telling their employees that they can stay home until they feel comfortable to come back. And I think that this is something that if I'm an employer and I'm hiring to fill a certain position, and I say that this position is online only because there isn't a ton of social interaction, and any social interaction to be had can be done over Zoom or WebEx or whatever video conferencing system, it actually serves me even better, because now I can market the role to not just people who live in Toronto or are willing to move to Toronto, but I can market this role to basically anybody that lives in Canada, anybody that's legally entitled to work in Canada. And for people who are in the workplace who are going to find jobs, I don't have to search for a job now that's just in Toronto. I'm going to be able to find cyber only roles that better suit my qualifications that I don't necessarily have to settle for. And this is going to create that challenge for a lot of employers to kind of attract talent, because now talent's going to also have a lot more power of where they're going to go. And to Noam, the other thing that Noam pointed out, yeah, if I'm a company that's renewing my lease and previously 98% of my workforce was working in the office, and now I realize only 50% of my workforce has to work in the office, I'm probably not going to need an entire floor in Scotia Plaza. I'm probably just going to use half of it. And this is going to put landlords in a really big, really difficult situation.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks guys. So I guess just while we're on that topic, we'll just jump around here. So Adam, what priorities do you think are going to end up changing for buyers and renters?
The priorities I think are going to change for buyers and renters is still going to be centered a lot around space, and it's going to be centered around price. I mean, right now what we're looking at is, because a lot of the banks have had deferred mortgage payments for individuals for up to 6 months, and 10% apparently of all according to one report of all mortgages have been deferred for some or all of those, are going to be deferred for some or all of those 6 months. We're in a holding pattern, right? So now the priorities for buyers and renters is going to be, I can live where I am right now, maybe in a little bit more cramped of a space, but I'm waiting to see when somebody has to sell their home and they're in a very, very difficult situation. So the immediate priority is going to be centered around price. And I think that I think Noam and Daniel have both pointed this out, once the dust settles and everything with COVID is behind us, there is going to be that desire for space. And we're going to see, I think, development and new apartment buildings, housing developments that are going up be centered around that.
To add to that, we're like, in terms of our various proposals, developments that are in development, we haven't seen a shift yet in terms of changing how much retail, how much office, how much residential, various size of units. But again, that's another question that, you know, both the other panelists have brought up, is if this goes on longer, developers and landlords are going to start rethinking what those proposals look like. One, from a pro forma cost point of view, whether it makes sense, can we market this? But also from a function point of view, if everyone is now working from home, do our unit sizes change? If retail isn't really, if retailers are closing and there's huge retail vacancy rates throughout Toronto, how are they going to sell new retail units within a new building? So I think right now we haven't seen that change start in terms of overall projects, but it is a possibility that depending on how long this goes, we can certainly see different types of development happening in the future.
I also think, just to add to both points, when looking for a property, you may, well, a couple of things. One is, I think that condo developers might consider how they design their spaces slightly differently, just to either allow for more flexible solutions or to have some sort of dedicated office work from home space in their offering. But I also think now when you look at a property and you're going to buy a house, you might think, like, your priorities have changed a little bit in the sense that you're now thinking, where can I work? Can I make this house or this residence work for me in terms of having somewhere dedicated that I can work every day? So where let's say a family of 4 might have looked for a 3-bedroom home for 1 room for each kid and the parents, now they might either, if they can't afford another room, they might put both kids in a room and use one of the rooms as a dedicated office. So I think, it might even be, we may see at some point, MLS saying 2 bedrooms and an office kind of thing, who knows? But I think that's where priorities will change, especially when people are spending a lot more time at home. And also maybe backyards. I think backyards will have a big impact on how, the yard, traditionally it was more about the house but I think, what you have outside of your house and the space you have access to, and if you're close to parks and things like that, will be a bigger factor now moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So one question I have for you, Daniel. So what are some challenges with moving to a fully virtual world for you?
So I think I mentioned this during my intro. In terms of day-to-day planning, with the exception of site visits, which are integral to urban planning, you have to go explore the space, you have to visit the space, you have to really understand neighborhoods. With the exception of that, almost everything can be done virtually. Research, writing, meetings with clients, designing. Everything is done through various Zoom meetings online. We all have access to servers. The City of Toronto is currently accepting applications virtually. Most of the applications, it's still an ongoing process. You can pay online. So for the most part, that's all done virtually. But I think the problem is with public meetings. There's still issues with accessibility and with equity. I don't know what the percentages are, but nowadays, a large percentage of people have internet, they have computers, they have access to let's say virtual public meeting. But the question is, if there's a development in some neighborhood, you have a requirement under the Planning Act to notify people nearby. So you can't just necessarily hope that they have internet and hope that they log on. You have to ensure that they are notified of that meeting. So how does that happen if you give them a letter that says you have to log on to this Zoom meeting? An 85-year-old grandmother might have a cell phone, but probably doesn't have access to a computer with Zoom and figure that out. So that's, a big question, because planning nowadays has to be equitable, has to consider, under the professional planners code of conduct, we have to consider everybody. And if online meetings happen virtually, then we're failing to do that. So I think that's a really big question, and I don't quite have an answer yet. Maybe we have some type of virtual link to a community center, and that's where the virtual meeting is shown. But definitely this is probably the biggest challenge I think that we would face if we went to a fully virtual world.
I just want to touch on the virtual world concept, not necessarily being a challenge, but something that we've always struggled with in the last few years is kind of merging the virtual world and the physical world. And I think, like Microsoft came out with, I don't remember the name of the device, but it's this kind of virtual reality set where you can move things around, and it's like an immersive virtual reality experience. And a lot of those have come out in the last few years, but haven't really taken off in the mainstream. It's been very specific to either gamers and whatnot. But I think now we might see more of that virtual world having more presence in our lives. So, I think Adam was saying this earlier, when you go and look for a viewing, maybe you don't necessarily need to go to the house anymore. You can kind of walk through it on your virtual headset. And, it kind of sounds very futuristic, but it is possible. And, we even have the opportunity now to change our backgrounds when we talk. I could put like the Bahamas behind me and change there's that kind of merge between the two worlds. And I would go as far as saying that we might see virtual meeting rooms where you go into this sort of virtual world and you can see your colleagues around you. You're actually in your basement on a headset. So those aren't necessarily challenges, but I think that is some of the merging between the two, the virtual and the physical, which we're starting to see now more often, even in this context right now where we're having this Zoom session, and I think would probably be in a physical session if this wasn't for COVID, a physical panel. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that from my industry, and my industry is very specific because the company that I work for buys and sells entire apartment buildings. So when you're dealing with some of the deals that we deal with, which are 25, 50, $100 million deals, and we need to check out the properties, you can't really do that virtually. Regardless of how virtual the world becomes, unless I can go to wherever the property is located, and our properties are located in the southern part of the United States, unless we can go see physically that property, we're probably not going to buy that property. So yes, there is a virtual element to it, which as we're doing a closing right now, so it does, obviously the virtual element does take a little bit longer. But I think at the end of the day, moving to a fully virtual world, at least in the industry I work in, is probably not going to be fully possible, or else I think the flow of major real estate is probably going to grind to a halt a little bit.
Unless you're buying virtual property, which is totally different.
Yeah, add me on Animal Crossing.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. So the Q&A session is now officially going to begin. And we have our first question sent in for Adam. So Adam, the question is, will properties along the subway line still hold their values? Has this affected the Crosslinks project across Eglinton?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, real estate is always going to be positively impacted by its location, related as it pertains to the subway line. That's part of the reason why I think the price of real estate around Yonge or around university, why those lines have typically been a little bit more valuable than ones that, for example, you have to take a bus or you have to walk a very far distance to get to. With regards to the Eglinton Crosslinks, when I live near Eglinton, so I can fully attest to everything that I've seen going on. Listen, my daughter's 3 years old. That Crosslinks is probably not going to be finished until she's married at the rate that it looks like it's going. And I think that when you looked at, for example, when the streetcar project on St. Clair is probably the best example of what the Crosslinks on Eglinton is going to be like. And it really negatively impacted a lot of businesses on St. Clair. A lot of them shut down because I have to drive past the property and make a U-turn around the tracks in order to be able to access it, to get to certain places. And I think that this project, as it continues to go on, it's going to impact businesses. I think even when it's completed, it's going to impact businesses as well.
So to jump in there, I disagree with some of that, but I do agree with some of that. in terms of construction, 100%, it's affecting businesses. I'm in the Little Jamaica part of Eglinton, and a lot of those businesses, they're struggling. Some of these mom and pop vegetable stores, they just don't have the same kind of foot traffic. And this was before COVID. They don't have the same kind of foot traffic to help sustain these stores when there's construction happening outside their front step. And then so the question is, can they weather these many years of construction? But I think that once construction is done, then you've now gone from vehicular traffic to now foot traffic. And I don't have the numbers, but people, when they're zipping by stores at 40, 60 kilometers an hour, they don't really see those retailers. So unless they're going to that specific destination, they're not going to jump into that store. But when you're walking, when you're cycling, you're actually able to experience that space differently. So now you might pop into a store that perks your interest. And we're seeing along St. Clair, and actually some retailers have now shut down because of COVID, unfortunately. This one great local bar, Dave's, they've been a local institution, and they've had to shut down because they basically said, even once the phases start opening up again, it's not 100%. And, we can't really sustain this model. So that's very sad. But, before COVID, you had walking traffic, and that is something, you have transit there, you have walking traffic there. And I think that those are the types of complete communities that, in terms of the planning world, that's what we're trying to really push, to really see.
Just to add as well, I saw today like a snippet on the news that they were trying to do bike paths where there's where there's subway lines, so like mimic the subway lines in bike paths. And in a way, that's, like, as Daniel's saying, is actually bringing more foot traffic to where these trains are going underground. Now you're actually bringing the people above ground with these, like, by this bike path initiative. I think they're doing it on Bloor Street, where they're trying to do bike lanes where the subway lines are. So it's kind of maintaining those transport trajectories throughout the city, which I think is really interesting, because now you're bringing a lot more people down there. And actually that's what really makes cities, is the people and density. And it goes back to the question of, like, how much can these stores open and allow people into their store at a time. If you're operating at 50% occupancy or capacity, you may not be able to stay afloat. But let's say previously you may not have as many people, now you have more people coming in kind of over a period of time. It might drive up some value in those spaces. I think it's still too early to tell again, but once we find ways to deal with this, then it might draw traffic. And if we get these bike lanes as a more permanent solution, I do think there is more value actually on these transit lines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question. It's directed at all, but I'm going to start with you, Noam. So the question is, I work for the real estate debt department of a bank, and office space needs are exactly what we're talking about. The issue is we may have more people working from home, but the people that do come into the office need to be spaced apart for now. So it could be a bit of a wash.
Could we what, sorry?
Could be a bit of a wash.
What's the question?
I believe the question is,
so like, I guess I could talk to that a little bit. So like, there's so many different things that building managers are doing right now. I've seen even proposals where, elevators are an issue, and you only have like 3 people in an elevator at a time, each facing a wall. So the first person, a wall of the cabin. So no one's facing each other, which is very uncomfortable. Or like controlled lineups into the building, controlling when people come into the office so that there's not too many people coming in at once. So like, staggering when people arrive. A lot more touchless technology where you sort of wave, touch. I read today about contactless toilets or something. I don't know how those would work, but basically toilets you don't have to touch. There's all this IoT coming out now where like Internet of Things, where basically different things within the toilet, the bathroom notify the building services when they're empty. So when you run out of toilet paper, rather than someone going in every hour to check, it will send a notification, you know, every half a day or whatever it is that the toilet paper is about to run out, things like that. So those are already starting to be implemented, and companies that's a lot where a lot of the innovation is happening as well. You know, we've seen in grocery stores that the screens are going up, spaces in between desks, and then maybe they have something where some people come in on some days and some people come in on others. So there are a lot of kind of temporary solutions, you know, that I think could work, but we don't know how efficient they are as well in protecting people from the virus. If you have people using the same ventilation system that's recycling the air all day, you know, those might need to be improved, and that's a huge expense to do something like that, and it's not possible to do, you know, overnight. It's you need permits and things like that, and there's no permit. Well, the permits have just opened up now, so you know, there is a process in doing that, but it's sort of a gradual process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from my perspective, to kind of get at the question, I think that yes, there's going to be more space required for fewer people, but I think that the whole way that we envision the office world working is going to change, and it's already started to change. A lot of the modern offices that I went to at my previous job, the satellite offices, each person had an office. Obviously, depending on your seniority, depended on the size of your office. And I think that a lot of offices now are going to shift away, from the bullpen cubicle system. So yes, you are going to, so while it does appear that you're going to need more room for fewer people, I think that you're also going to require, I think there's also going to be more of a just sectioned off system in the offices, as opposed to it being as wide open as it was up until now.
Okay, great. So I'm going to take one more question, and I think this might be the last one, just for time. So the question is directed initially to Adam. So do you think the potential reduced future use of office and brick and mortar retail space justifies the reduced values of some diversified REITs like H&R Block or Brookfield property, which are trading at 40% to 50% of book value?
Right. So my personal opinion is that most REITs, pretty much all REITs, with the exception of retail only REITs, are a good buy, because I mean, effectively the market just tanked beneath a point of where the values of the stocks were worth. So yeah, H&R, Brookfield, those deal with more on the retail side. No, sorry, not more on the retail side. Sorry, more on the office space side. Excuse me. I think that their values, you're basically buying their stocks for 35-40 cents on the dollar, like the person who posed the question said. So yeah, there is value in, I think, in purchasing any stock, with the exception of a retail REIT, because we don't know how badly retail is going to be impacted. But yes, I think that those stocks personally would be ones that I would invest in, especially where they're at right now.
Okay, great. So thanks, everyone. So I'm just going to wrap up the discussion with one last question for everyone. So I guess the real question is, what lessons can we learn from COVID? So I guess, Daniel, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. I think one big takeaway is, we can do it. I think what COVID has shown is that when people are put under pressure, when people are faced with a major challenge, they can figure it out. Especially when COVID started, it was still basically winter weather, and we were facing a major problem with people experiencing homelessness. And I don't have the numbers, but they were able to find hotel suites that were empty. They were able to figure out the problem. They were able to temporarily house people experiencing homelessness. You saw that there were hospitals built in a matter of days. Whereas, I think people always complain about red tape with government, red tape with City Hall. But I think sometimes when push comes to shove, it can be figured out. What I mentioned before, that they closed down Lakeshore. They said, okay, we're going to close down 3 lanes of traffic and we're going to open it up to pedestrians and cyclists. And they did that with using jersey barriers and orange pylons. So I think that this is, kind of a good news story. It's a great lesson that we can take away, that when we really put our mind to it, we could achieve anything.
Great. We'll pass it over to Noam.
So yeah, I think, this shows that we are resilient as a human race, and we can adapt to any situation. And again, as I mentioned before, when there's like challenges and we're faced with really extreme challenges to, the way that we live and work, that's when the most innovation comes out, and when we see, incredible innovation happening. And I, there was a question here as well, that I just saw that was posed to everyone. It kind of ties into this: is how do we, how are we adapting, and how do we as professionals adapt, as a result of COVID? And just speak from myself. So my background is architecture and design, and now I've just pivoted into doing co-working consultancy for landlords, because I feel like that's where a huge percentage of the market is going to go. So we're basically helping landlords essentially convert their spaces into flexible space. I wouldn't say co-working, it's now a flexible space term. But again, that's sort of how I'm adapting to this challenge, and bringing in my strengths from workplace design and what I know in that industry, to help landlords adapt themselves. So yeah, we adapt, and we're resilient, and we prevail.
For sure.
Yeah, so, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just passing it off to you again. Go ahead.
My lessons that I've honestly learned from COVID is that we were always trending in the direction, I think, that COVID has forced us to now realize much, much, much faster than what we originally we're going there exponentially faster. We have to create better logistics and build better industrial sites, more industrial sites, because of the online nature of the world. We need to conserve space in order to be able to do that. So again, retail may be something that's going to be not phased out, but lessened considerably as a result of this. And I think that for people, when it comes to multi-residential, and Noam and Daniel have pointed this out earlier, the reason why a lot of people are moving to the more southern places like Miami, like Texas, is because ultimately, aside from the fact that in a lot of these places, it's cheaper. I mean, not Miami, but Florida in general, it's typically cheaper. But there's more space there. And I think that people ultimately, they do want space. I don't think it's going to be as wide ranging as a lot of people think. But I think that really what I've seen is COVID is just making us jump to our conclusion a lot faster than we were getting there before. So that's something that I've learned a lot from what we've seen the last few months.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you to Daniel. Thank you to Noam. Thank you to Adam for a really engaging and thrilling discussion. I definitely learned a lot personally. And thank you to everyone who joined us. If anyone wants to watch this webinar again, if you want to just brush up on the points, it will be on the JNF YouTube page tomorrow. And until then, everyone stay healthy, be safe, be well, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.